The year is 1914, and World War I had just started. The prolific science fiction author H.G. Wells published a novel called The World Set Free. Wells's book discussed the dangers of scientific advancement as humanity discovered a devastating new weapon. The novel is often overshadowed by his more famous works, which include War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. The World Set Free was arguably more significant than his previous books, for it coined the term atomic bomb. Keep in mind that this was over 3 decades before the first nuclear weapons were tested. The book would later inspire the greatest minds in the world to create the most powerful weapon in history. Little did H.G. Wells know that his warning about the dangers of human advancement would come true. On September 12, 1933, the theoretical physicist Leo Szilard was lounging in a hotel lobby. At the time, he was one of many Jewish refugees in London. While reading the Times, Szillard's eye was caught by the second column, a summary about Ernest Rutherford's speech on transforming atoms. Rutherford was a physicist made famous for his contributions to the recent discovery of the neutron. In his speech, he claimed that harnessing atomic energy was inefficient and impossible on an industrial scale. Szilard would later write his opinions about Rutherford's views on atomic power. Pronouncements of experts to the effect that something cannot be done have always irritated me. That's exactly how he said it. In other words, he disliked experts such as Rutherford determining for others what is or isn't possible. After finishing the article, Szilard left the hotel and went for a walk with no destination in mind. Reading the article had placed Szilard on a path to disprove Rutherford's moonshine talk. While walking through the streets of London, he stopped for a red light at the intersection of Southampton and Russell Square. When the light turned green, everything changed. By the time Szilard finished crossing, he had conceived an idea that would alter the course of human history. Scientists like Rutherford have been attempting to exploit the enormous energy inside the atom. They did this by bombarding an atom with alpha particles, which are also called helium nuclei. This process is tedious because the atom is mostly empty space. With every million alpha particles shot, only one hits the nucleus. To form the atom, the alpha particle must be added to the atom's nucleus. But because both the nucleus and alpha particle are positively charged, they repel one another. This is why Rutherford thought that atomic energy would be impossible. Szilard thought differently. It occurred to him that the recently discovered neutron would be a perfect probe to invade the nucleus. Neutrons aren't charged, which means they won't interact with the electrons that would otherwise block its path, and it wouldn't be repelled by the nucleus. Once a neutron enters a sufficiently large nucleus, the atom would split, expelling 2 or 3 more neutrons. The mass of the 2 new nuclei would be less than the amount of the original atoms. Mass is converted into energy when the atom split. This principle directly relates to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. A small amount of mass multiplied by the speed of light squared will give you a lot of energy. If there are other atoms in the vicinity, then the 2 new neutrons could split those atoms as well. This means one atom can split 2, which then can split 4, then 8, and 16, and so on. Szilard would call it the nuclear reaction. The enormous energy released from every split atom could make a devastating weapon. The nuclear bombs from the book The World Set Free were now possible. This realization bothered Szilard. If such a device were to be built, the Germans had a good chance at being the first, and the Germans meant the Nazis. His fear followed him for 6 years until 1939. News from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute reached him. The German chemist Otto Hahn had split a uranium atom using a neutron, just as Szilard predicted. In 1938, Leo Szilard migrated to America. With the aid of Einstein, Szilard wrote a letter to President Roosevelt which urged him to fund nuclear weapons research before the Nazis built an atomic bomb. The following year, Roosevelt established the Uranium Committee, a program tasked with researching atomic fission of uranium. Many well-known scientists were part of the committee, including Lyman Briggs, Harold Urey, Arthur Compton, and Ernest Lawrence. Through rigorous testing and experimentation, the committee concluded that isotopes uranium-235 and plutonium-239 would be the ideal fuel sources to sustain a nuclear reaction. On November 1, 1939, they recommended the U.S. government obtain a supply of uranium oxide and fund research for isotope separation. After isolating enough of U-235, the committee calculated its critical mass, the smallest amount of matter to produce a chain reaction. They then found out how fast the neutron needed to be fired to trigger fission. With most of the scientific nuances discovered, the project was passed on to the United States Army Corps of Engineers in 1942. Research continued in other facilities around the country, codenamed Manhattan District. Among these research facilities were Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Richland, Washington. The theoretical physicist Robert Oppenheimer oversaw the rest of the program. Oppenheimer was a genius who had a taste for Hindu scripture. He taught himself how to read 8 languages, and he studied at 6 colleges. When World War II began in 1939, he held 2 full physics professorships. Oppenheimer was only 38 when assigned to oversee the Manhattan Project. For 2 years under his direction, a team of 3,500 scientists worked on constructing the bomb. On July 16, 1945, at Los Alamos, the test bomb, known as the Gadget, was detonated. When Oppenheimer witnessed the test, he recalled a Hindu passage.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
A month later, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The bomb, known as Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima, and Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. At least 185,000 people died. Japanese culture was forever changed. Entertainment in Japan began to tackle new themes, such as the consequences of nuclear weapons and war. A prime example of this is 1954's Godzilla, a film about a fire-breathing behemoth that terrorizes Japan after an atomic bomb awakens it. Many argue that the kaiju genre was Japan anthropomorphizing the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States, and World War II ended less than a month later. America celebrated victory. And why wouldn't they? The United States had outsized the rest of the globe and won the war because of it. The US was on top of the world, and everyone had a happy ending, right? Not exactly. News of Russia detonating their first atomic bomb quickly reached the US. When one war ends, a new Cold War begins.
He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He He did what we all must learn to do.
It's ironic that the first nuclear weapons protesters were the men who created them. Before the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Leo Szilard attempted to start a petition to prevent such an event from happening. His message never reached President Truman. Many military personnel, including Lieutenant General Leslie Groves, an overseer of the Manhattan Project, found Szilard's petition distasteful. After the petition failed, Groves looked for incriminating evidence to punish Szilard. No evidence was found, and Szilard was never tried for any wrongdoing. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't so lucky. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission held a hearing regarding Oppenheimer's loyalty and his past associations with the Communist Party. Many of Oppenheimer's friends and family were known communists. He also opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb on the grounds that the construction would be impractical. The Atomic Energy Commission accused Oppenheimer of being unloyal to the United States and for hindering the development of the hydrogen bomb. He denied all of this, but admitted he did discuss communist ideas with his peers. When the hearing was finished, he was labeled a security risk, and his clearance at the AEC was removed. Oppenheimer no longer had any political power. Just a few years before, he was an American hero for winning World War II. The name traitor followed him to his grave. I'm sure many of you watching are probably thinking that the world would have been a better place without nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project is responsible for wiping out 2 cities worth of people. Men, women, and children, obliterated in an instant. Is scientific advancement ethical? Perhaps H.G. Wells was right. Maybe human progress is too dangerous and should be halted for our own sake. That's what I thought before Oppenheimer's former teacher, Dr. Brigman of Harvard, changed my mind. When the scientists at the Manhattan Project expressed their guilt over the bombings, Dr. Brigman responded by saying, "Scientists aren't responsible for the facts that are in nature. It's their job to find the facts. There's no sin connected with it, no morals. If anyone should have a sense of sin, it's God. He put the facts there." At first, I disagreed with Dr. Brigman, but with time, I realized that his statement carried truth. Splitting an atom is arguably no more reprehensible than starting a fire. No matter how much we dislike the nuclear sciences, we can't change the facts we observe in nature. This is especially important to remember when our world leaders reject scientific consensus to promote their social, political, and economic agendas.
There really is climate change, and I thought, wow, what an impact. What an impact that would make.
I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. We're talking...
So, taking God at his word in Genesis, dinosaurs lived beside people about 6,000 years ago. And they were vegetarian to start with. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 tells us...
And the earth is...
Flat.
The earth is flat.
Yes, the Manhattan Project is responsible for thousands of deaths, but it's important to take into consideration all the research that has benefited humanity. Without the funding the Manhattan Project received, nuclear science would have been held back by decades, or even centuries. Nuclear energy isn't perfect, but it generates 11% of the world's electricity, according to the data from the World Nuclear Association. Millions of people are saved each year by nuclear medicine, compared to the 185,000 people who died in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The lives saved don't justify the ones lost, but to say the Manhattan Project hasn't benefited humanity would be disingenuous. The Voyager space probes were launched in 1977, and to this day are still sending data back to Earth. This wouldn't be possible without the radioactive isotope plutonium-238, which powers the 2 spacecrafts. Conventional batteries wouldn't last as long, and solar power wouldn't be an option in deep space. The only choice was nuclear energy. Without the research done by the Manhattan Project, these images of our solar system wouldn't exist. The facts that are present in the universe aren't good or evil. It's silly to impose human morality onto things we have no control over. While taking all the necessary precautions, scientists should try to push boundaries. Only when we understand the facts in nature can science set the world free.